Yes, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real honor for me to be here in Kyiv. I'm a frequent visitor to this country, but I have not been here in 2 years. And so I am going to stray from what I was asked to talk about with the indulgence of the organizers and offer you what are some personal reflections upon my return here. Yesterday I went to Maidan and saw the very powerful symbols of what has taken place in this country since November. And it was a very moving experience for me, as I know it is for all of you in this room and for the people who live in this country. And it reminded me of what the people who sacrificed stood for. They made the ultimate sacrifice in order to fight for a better country, a better Ukraine. And so thinking about those brave people who are out in the square, out in the streets, in terrible weather, facing enormous risks and sacrifices, has reinforced in my mind the responsibility that we all have, whether we're citizens of Ukraine, of the United States, we're citizens of the world, to do what we can to help bring about a Ukraine that is democratic, that is based on rule of law, respect for dignity, respect for human rights. I've been to Tahrir Square in Cairo. I was there soon after events of January, February of 2011, where nearly 900 people were killed by security forces, where Egyptians were fighting for a similar kind of future for their country. And their sacrifices, sadly, are forgotten in the past, as the revolution of those days has been hijacked and stolen, and the demands for dignity and human rights have not been respected in Egypt. We must not let that happen here in Ukraine. Ukraine, after all, is in the heart of Europe. It is a key to fulfilling and realizing the vision of a Europe whole, free, and at peace. Accordingly, the West has an obligation to help Ukraine, to help it politically, to help it financially, to help it with economic assistance and advice, to help it with military assistance, intelligence sharing, so that Ukraine can defend itself and reverse the violations that have been committed by it by Putin's Russia. We have to help Ukraine ensure that elections take place on May 25th. Elections that are credible and are deemed free and fair. We have to help civil society, which played a key role in events of the past few months and, frankly, of the past few years. Independent media, also a key factor in this country's past and future. We need to stress the importance of an inclusive, tolerant society. Those who say that supporting Ukraine is the best way to respond to Russia are right, but they're only partly right. It's hard to help Ukraine, and it's hard for Ukrainians to help themselves when their country has been invaded, when there are tens of thousands of Russian troops on the border posing a continued threat. In the face of naked Russian aggression, the West cannot sit by and engage in business as usual. When we in the West say something is unacceptable, we cannot simply utter the words and then do nothing about it. We have to give meaning to the word unacceptable, which means we have to do something to try to reverse something that we say we do not accept. The 2 rounds of sanctions that the US and EU have announced have been a decent response, but nowhere near enough. If we do not impose a serious price for Putin's actions and behavior, then not only Ukraine will be in crisis, but we will have a much bigger crisis on our hands. Our enemies will no longer fear us. Our friends will no longer have confidence in us. If instead of reacting to what's taking place, the West tries to prevent and preempt further efforts by Putin to destabilize Ukraine, if we fail to do that, Putin's eyes and appetite will only get bigger. And his dangerous and reckless actions will only continue. After all, the people on Maidan represented everything that Putin is against, demanding freedom, an end to corruption, rule of law, transparency, even an orientation with the West. What happened here in Ukraine fed into Putin's paranoia. For he saw what happened in Ukraine and feared this could happen in Russia too. And he's launched an even further crackdown that was already ugly enough since his return to power. The worst crackdown on human rights in Russia since the breakup of the Soviet Union. Hence his efforts to destabilize Ukraine, to make it unattractive and unappealing to the West. Putin thinks he's winning. We have to prove him wrong. Russia's economy is vulnerable, I would argue, to tough, hard-hitting sanctions. And true, there may be a price for those of us in the West in imposing such sanctions, but what is the alternative? How we in the West rise to the challenge says as much about us as it does about Russia or Ukraine. Will we allow corrupt Russian money to buy Western inaction and passivity? Will we sit by and watch Putin destabilize Ukraine, maybe not by sending troops across the border, though that can't be ruled out, but through other means and methods, using provocateurs in the East, cutting off gas? Will we do nothing about this? Are we not worried that Moldova might be next? Or maybe one of the Baltic states, which, let's remember, come with Article 5 guarantees. Haven't we seen this movie before? And did we not like the end? I know it's easy for an American to sit here and call for tougher measures against Russia. Our trade with Russia is 1/10 of what it is between Europe and Russia. But are we going to place our business interests above our national security interests? Are we going to place these interests above principle, which is what we're supposed to stand for and represent?
1 minute.
And more importantly, what those who sacrificed on Maidan stood for. I would argue that the world has never faced a graver crisis in decades, possibly since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Putin has assaulted not only Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, he has attacked the very concept of people's rights to determine their own future and the very concept of freedom itself. This is not a time for wait and see, for business as usual. This is a time to show resolve, to show strong leadership, and a time for the West to stand in solidarity with Ukraine against the very real serious threat posed by Putin. We must not accept, de facto or de jure, the annexation of Crimea, just as we did not accept the absorption of the Baltic states by the Soviet Union. Modern authoritarianism, and Putin is one of the leaders of it, represents a threat to everyone, a threat to freedom, a threat to democracy everywhere. The democratic world has to take a strong stand and push back against this threat. We owe it to ourselves, we owe it to future generations, and just as importantly, we owe it to the people who sacrificed their lives on Maidan. Thank you.